The economic collapse of Argentina back in 2001 crippled the country's economy, but the country rebounded. It hasn't been entirely turbulence-free, however. Let's take a look. In 2001, it defaulted on $100 billion of debts or bonds. At the time, that was about half of its total economic output. Government borrowing had soared during a decade of economic growth. Now, by 2005, creditors had agreed to write off about 3/4 of what they were owed, paving the way to recovery. But now the economy is weakening again, and inflation is around 13%, eating away at Argentina's reserves. This week, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered Argentina to pay back those creditors who refused to write off their loans. If Argentina doesn't do this by the end of the month, it could be at risk of defaulting again. High stakes. Let's get some more analysis on this situation with Kathryn Rooney Vera from investment firm Bulltick Capital. She joins us from Miami. Kathryn, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Sean.
We kind of overstated there because basically the U.S. Supreme Court just didn't weigh in. They've been asked to overturn a court's decision. They said they just don't want any part of this. Kind of talk to me about where we stand now. It's a small percentage of people who held out, about, what, 7%. But this could cripple Argentina. What's at stake here?
Well, I think, Sean, really what's happening here is that the U.S. Supreme Court decided not to accept an appeal by Argentina of a ruling that in 2013 required that Argentina pay the holdouts par. So full payment on holdouts from the 2001 default after two offerings of restructuring pricing in 2005 and 2010. So these holdouts, the 7% that you mentioned, have rejected two offers and are requiring full payment. Now, the New York Appeals Court granted that. So at this point, where we're at is that Argentina has to pay the holdouts unless they come to a settlement or unless they find a way to continue to pay what we call performing debt, as well as or instead of holdouts.
Now, there we see the president who called these investors who were holding out vultures, and among them Paul Singer. People in the United States simply don't have an appetite right now to help the real wealthy Wall Street time after what they did to the U.S. economy, then demanded to be bailed out. Is it fair to look at these investors who wanted to be paid back fully as vultures?
Well, I can understand what part of what Argentina is saying. There are some guys out there that bought distressed Argentine debt at low prices and are requiring full payment. There are others, Sean, that actually were bondholders back then, small Italians, for example, that got defaulted and decided to hold out. Look, at the end of the day, I think this is an important thing from the point of view from the markets because that it can set a poor precedent. I think this is a really important point, Sean. What we're seeing here is that precedent may be set that if you hold out and if you don't agree in a restructuring, you might get paid par. So this could have serious repercussions for future debt restructurings going forward. I think that's a really important point.
Kind of expand on that just a bit because there is an offer on the table to these entities that did hold out, about 20 cents on the dollar, whereas those who, the 93% that did resolve it, are being 23 to 25%. Why would they go for that? And does Argentina have the money to pay these people?
Well, Argentina doesn't have the money, but I think, Sean, that the willingness is entirely there. Argentina wants to pay. They don't want to go into default. It's entirely related to capacity to do so. So reserves have been plummeting, and Argentina can't afford the $1.5 billion and then maybe 15 to 20 billion afterwards that would come from paying both the holdouts and the performing debt holders. But Argentina wants to pay. They want to be able to tap the markets again. They have big financing needs, and they have a big oil company called YPF that desperately needs funding to develop large oil fields.
And we're talking about the third largest economy in Latin America. Let's look forward just a bit. If the World Cup continues to move along, and then after the Olympics come, if Brazil is in economic turmoil, if Argentina hits economic turmoil, what can this do to the global economy?
Well, I think Argentina could go into turmoil, Sean, but I think it's really important to differentiate what could happen now if there's a technical fault versus what happened in 2001. I don't think what happened in 2001 will be repeated. Argentina's in a different place at this point. The financial sector is very unlikely to implode as it did in 2001, and Argentina, if it does default, will have to devalue to preserve some of its reserves. So I think it's a different situation. Brazil is not in recession. I think Brazil is going to grow 1.5% this year. So in broad broad terms, Latin America is going to continue to slow down, but I don't think it's going to go into recession. And I think, of course, emerging markets remain the main driver of global growth, but I think that growth is going to continue to come from Asia versus Latin America this year.
Kathryn, quickly, how important are the next couple of weeks? Because these payments could come due June 30th. And if Argentina doesn't have the money, and these companies that held out now have the ability to look into their bank accounts to see, yes, you do have the money, Argentina, pay us, what could happen?
Well, there's definitely a high probability of a selective default if they don't settle. It seems at this point that the two sides are talking. Argentina's talking to the holdouts. They're trying to get to a deal, but there's a high risk of selective default come the end of this month when $816 million in interest payments are due.
Kathryn, you did a great job explaining something very complex to us. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you for having me, Sean.